Yeah. Okay, so we're off. No, I love this place. I love this church. I love Wayne. Everybody. It's one of my favorite events. Well, it is my favorite event throughout the year. So, but I just want to kind of jump right in and think about some of these things. First of all, I want to talk about just for a minute the importance of storytelling. It's a part of the human condition. And we are made, we think in stories, we communicate in stories, we talk in stories. That's why you have creative literature. It's why you had ancient myths and other things before there were a great deal of writing mediums. It existed in oral forms, which were later codified and kind of put down. And so there's something about stories that humans are drawn to, and we think that way and we communicate that way. And look, the story of the Bible is the greatest story. I mean, it's phenomenal. And one of the things that makes a story great is that stories are circular, which doesn't really make sense to some people, but it is. It's circular. That is, it will begin with something, and it will go through all the details, and it'll come back around, and then at the end, you're right back where you started. For an example, in Genesis 1 and 2, we see how God created the world. Man is in paradise. Now, I'm giving a literary analysis of it. I'm not saying that it is fiction. There's very big difference in those two things. Okay? But if you look at it simply through the lens of a literary piece, the fact that it begins in the Garden of Eden in Revelation 21 and 22, not completely, because it does have parts of Ezekiel in it, but in a great portion, it is composed off the image of the Garden of Eden. Okay? The story is circular. And so it becomes one of the storylines of Scripture is the dwelling place of God and how that process develops. So, now, before we get into this, and I don't think I have to say it, but I do say it just for that sake, and that is, we're all agreeing that the Bible is the main book. All right? The Bible is the book that helps us check every other thing that we come in contact with, not just that we read, that we see, that we hear, all of that stuff. So the Bible is our guide, and it enables us to read well. Okay? Now, it is, I find it very interesting that when God chose to communicate to us, He left us a book. Okay? That tells me something about some of those things. So, what we're going to do is we're going to run through a bunch of books. I just sat down and thought about it. I've broken them into different sections. And they're usually going to be 2 per slide here. And I put pictures up here because I prefer to see a book. If I see it, I can at least recognize the cover when I'm out and kind of go through some of those things. And so let's just run through them. We're going to start in what I call devotional type. As you know, not all books are soul food. They don't feed your soul. They may give you good information, but you got to do some extra work to build on that information. But there are some that are just meant to nourish you and to feed your soul. Well, and one of those, it comes from one particular writer, which is Dane Ortland. Now, Dane Ortland is Presbyterian. That colors his theology in his way of understanding things. But his book, Gentle and Lowly, The Heart of Christ for Sinners and Sufferers, a lot of people have the notion that God is against them. This book will teach you to embrace Jesus as not someone who is against you and who is repulsed by you, but actually someone who is drawn to you. Okay? Then you have the book Deeper, which he wrote in a small series of books called the Union series. You can kind of see it there in the top left-hand corner of the cover. But in Deeper, Real Change for Real Sinners, what he's talking about, you see, a lot of times, whether we mean to or not, we communicate change, that the way people change is we call the specific sin and we tell people to stop doing it. Actually, until people find a reason to change, someone who is worth changing for, rarely will they ever do it. Deeper is about going deeper into the heart of God and finding someone worth changing for. Okay? Now, next is A Place to Belong. This is a book that I'm actually currently reading. I haven't completely finished it, but it's very good. And it has such a positive and an adoring image of local churches. One of the things that as I get older, and I'm not old, but one of the things as I get older that I appreciate is just the simplicity of the church. And she has a way with words. I mean, it's phenomenal the way she writes. You just kind of look at one of those paragraphs and go, that's just impressive. And I don't do that very often. But she builds on, she says we should see the church the way God sees it. And so she gives 9 images from Scripture about the church and talks to us about how we view it and how that comes to us. And how, for an example, she has a chapter on shepherds. And she says, these people, if you recognized them at the grocery store, if you saw them at the grocery store, there would be nothing extraordinary about them. But they're the grace of Christ in your life, hidden amongst common people. And she has such a beautiful presentation. The next one is a book that was very important for me, prayer. I don't know about you. Prayer for me has always been difficult. I've always had a lot of struggles with it, trying to understand it. And to be honest with you, at 38, I've spent more time away from home than I was at home. I don't know if it's what I was taught or simply how I perceived what I was taught. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter. I've got to deal with it regardless. So this book helped me. Yancey, I will say it, and I call him this, and Yancey is my spirit animal, okay? I don't know how else to explain it. The guy asks the same questions that I ask, okay? He writes, he's interested, and the things that are concerning to him are the same things somehow that always concern me. And I don't know how that works. But in this book, Prayer Does It Make Any Difference? He addresses the hard issues. Now, Yancey is a journalist by trade, by profession. And so he writes from, a lot of people, when they write from their small circle of existence. Yancey writes from a worldwide scope. And that changes the way you see certain subjects. And so it's one that I always highly recommend. Another one is Yancey's book. I read this probably a couple of years ago, and that is his book, Reaching for the Invisible God. And the premise behind the book is the troubles that come along with serving a God you cannot see. Why is it that idols held such a prominent notion? One of them. Well, you could see them. How do you, listen, I'm a guy that if you were to in the personality tests and different things, words of affirmation are important to me, okay? Do you know how many times I've been in a situation where I thought, I wish I could just see God for just a minute and have him go, that's it. He doesn't have to say anything, just go, that's it. Yes, you're right. That would make me feel so much better. This book deals with a lot of those issues, and again, he handles them beautifully. Eugene Peterson, this is a book I read, I guess last year sometime. The Psalms as Tools for Prayer. He does a tremendous job. And so I would recommend it. It's a very thin, very short book, maybe 100 pages, and I think it's worth your time. Another book is Strangely Bright by Joe Rigney, and the subtitle to it is Can You Love God and Enjoy This World? Okay? The importance that God has given to us things to richly enjoy, and there's nothing wrong. As a matter of fact, there's something right about us enjoying the world as we have it. It's natural creations. The things in it, they're good. I mean, Christianity is not even, your relationship with God is not even separated from going to watch a sporting event. Okay? There's something to that. I'm not saying it's like some worship experience, right? But it's something about life that we can enjoy, or that we go out in nature together and we enjoy. And he kind of walks through some of that. Now, Timothy Keller, his book, Forgive, the last book he wrote before he died. In my opinion, it was his best book. So when it comes to forgiveness, a lot of people take what I'm going to say, and I mean this kindly, and I think you understand that, an overly simplistic and naive approach to forgiveness. If we learned anything from what came out in the Southern Baptist Convention's gross mishandling of sexual misconduct amongst their leaders, we learned that, oh, well, you forgive them, so we're not going to the police. Now, wait a minute. No. That's not how this works. You committed a crime. There can be forgiveness, but that doesn't exempt you from earthly penalties. And I think about an occasion where a woman, her husband had been cheating on her, and now he's her ex-husband, but he went forward and repented. Um, and she was trying to talk to somebody in the local church about the fact that even though he said he repented, he hasn't really. He's still acting in ways that are inconsistent. And you could not imagine the amount of Christian people who said, when she'd start to talk, go, whoa, 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 and I can't hear that now. I can't hear you talk about that. He's been forgiven. He's repented. Come on. That is not what God has in mind. Now, if she were there to run him in the ground when he had changed, that'd be one thing. But if you're establishing a pattern of behavior that shows that supposed penitence was not really penitence, that's a whole different thing. And so Keller does a good job of handling a lot of these issues just in a phenomenal way. Another Yancey book is Disappointment with God. A lot of people feel very uncomfortable even with the title. And he starts it with the story of an individual who expected God to do miraculous things and how it ended up hurting his faith. But listen, sometimes, whatever you want to call it, you don't want to call it disappointment, call it something else. We ask God for things, we talk to Him about situations, and it doesn't go the way we wanted it to. We're disappointed. Okay? We're not leaving God, we're not cursing God, we're just disappointed. All right, now this next one, this is actually our theme at Moulton this year, Life Together. Bonhoeffer. So this book is very interesting because, Bonhoeffer is the German theologian that opposed Hitler. Okay? So in this one, this book is written out of his experience. While the Third Reich was rising, he was asked to come and serve at an underground seminary in Germany. Okay? And so 25 preaching students, several faculty. And so this book comes out of meditations on what he learned during those times, like why Christian fellowship is so important. And one of the statements he makes in the book that I've actually used as the subtitle for our theme at Moulton is, he says, never underestimate the incomparable joy of the physical presence of another Christian in your life. He said, you may not understand that. The people who take that for granted are the people who have it all the time. But people like him, who would then spend years in prison before he was executed, living in isolation, you learn not to take for granted the ability to go to church and all of those things. So it's very good to feed your soul. God shines forth. That's a little blurry, and I'm sorry about that, but it is what it is. So this is in that Union series as well. Now look, when it comes to evangelism, obviously, Jesus said it. I'm for it. I've always kind of struggled with how I've heard people try to be motivated to do evangelism. And I never really knew how to express what I had. These thoughts, in essence, I kind of had thrown up on a whiteboard, so to speak, in my mind, but I couldn't synthesize it. I couldn't bring it all together. And so I was reading this book, and I stopped and I called one of my friends, Robert, and I said, listen to this. I said, that's it. That's what I've been trying to say, because I'd been talking to him about it. I said, Robert, I just can't nail it down. This is what I've been trying to say, and he said it. And that is that evangelism must flow from a deep and abiding relationship with God and His glory, and a love that drives you to share that with other people. It can't be about, here's my evangelistic target. Listen, people today can smell when they're targets. I mean, even the research is telling us that. Okay? Furthermore, I have a problem with thinking of people as targets, where my interest in you is only dependent upon how you respond to the message I have for you. That doesn't sound like Jesus to me. He seemed to be always interested in people regardless of how they responded to him. Okay? So, I think that's a good soul-feeding book. Biblical studies, a little bit more technical in some things. So Everett Ferguson, obviously, he's from the state of Texas. For all I know, I think he's still alive in a nursing home. But tremendous biblical scholar. The fact that he got this book, which is basically a discussion of the beliefs of the Churches of Christ published by a major evangelical press, is phenomenal. But it's a great treatment of simple things like salvation. It's not exactly a systematic theology, but kind of. This book is, you can sometimes find it for free on Amazon. It's not expensive, but Women in the Church, the uh, it's asking the question really about women's leadership in the church, which, by the way, if you're not aware, that's becoming a very big issue once again. And what you have, whether you agree with Ferguson on everything or not, what you have is a guy. Okay, people use the word scholar loosely in my judgment. Okay, this may sound strange to you, but even if you have a PhD, it doesn't make you a scholar. Okay, a scholar is someone who is actually involved in the scholarly debates and discussions and progressing the body of knowledge. Everett Ferguson, not just by people who are members of the Churches of Christ, but denominational bodies who disagree with almost everything that the guy believes, know that there is no early church expert that exceeded him. Matter of fact, you read some of their books that talk about preaching and books that you should buy, Everett Ferguson is on their lists. Okay? So he knows what he's doing. Now, these books are by Richard Hayes. Now, caveat about this. Richard Hayes just died recently. He was a teacher at Duke. He and his son wrote a book that look, if you want to read it out of interest, okay, don't believe what it says. It's called The Widening of God's Mercy. It's about accepting the homosexual community in churches and ministry, okay? His son is much more liberal, teaches at Fuller. But anyway, these books were groundbreaking. They're called echoes. So a lot of times when people think of how the Old Testament is used in the New Testament, we think, oh, well, that's a prophecy about Jesus. Look, if you start in Matthew 1 and you start going fast, it ain't going to take you long till you get into chapter 2 when he says, out of Egypt I have called my son, and you go back and look at Hosea 11:1 and go, that ain't talking about Jesus? What in the world is going on? You see, the way that they sometimes would quote the Old Testament was not to say this was a prophecy that was uttered, but sometimes saying, this is the language that they used, and I'm borrowing biblical language. For an example, somebody might say, on a rainy, ugly day outside, when we're in here and we say, this is the day the Lord has made, we'll rejoice and be glad in it, even though it's a gloomy day. Is that exactly what the psalmist had in mind when he wrote it? Nope. But it is the language. Okay? And so echoes has to do with all this stuff. For an example, let me give you just one. In Mark chapter 6, when the disciples are on the water and Jesus is walking on the water. It says in Mark's account, I believe, that he intended to pass them by. I've always been fascinated by that phrase. What in the world does that mean? Okay, if you look at the Greek construction of that phrase, you'll find it 2 other times in the Old Testament, in the Septuagint. When God passed by Moses in Exodus 32, and when he passed by the presence of Elijah in 1 Kings 18. So in essence, what he's saying is, I'm not saying that I can prove every bit of this with solidarity. What he's saying is, consider it. When Jesus meant to pass them by, well, the last 2 times, the only 2 other times this phrase is used in Greek literature, was when God made a major revelation about himself to Moses and to Elijah. And when he gets back in the boat after this experience, what do they say about him? You're the Son of God. I'm telling you. The guy knows what he's doing. And if you will think with him, he will bless you. Okay? All right? Theology for the Community of God, Stanley J. Grins. It's a little blurry. It's just systematic theology, but it's a wonderful, a wonderful treatment of it. That basically God lives in community, and that flows out of why we have community, which relates to Bonhoeffer's book. Then this is another systematic theology. And by systematic theology, we just mean, obviously, the fundamentals of the faith, questions and how they're answered. Jack Cottrell he died last year or the year before, Christian church scholar, studied at Princeton, historical theology. Here's a book, and this will get me to 66, John Baker. Here's a book that's not on here, but it's an interesting book dealing with his study of historical theology. Right before he died, it may not have been his last one, but he wrote a book called Baptism, Zwingli or the Bible. Because Zwingli was the guy. People say, where did this notion come that baptism wasn't for the remission of sins? His name is Huldrych Zwingli. And Cottrell writes about that because his PhD was in the history of theology, which is, how did ideas develop? When did things change? And he does a masterful job of exposing that. But that book is is phenomenal. The Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing, Jonathan Pennington, he teaches at Southern Seminary in Louisville. Phenomenal read. That's all I can really say about it. It will speak for itself. I wouldn't preach on the Sermon on the Mount without looking at it. That's how highly I hold it. Revelation and the End of All Things. Craig Kester, Harvard, I think when he died. So this is a smaller commentary on Revelation. He has a big one in the Anchor Bible series. But so when most people interpret Revelation, they interpret it in a linear way. That is, it's predicting events that go in a certain direction. Kester believes, and if I'm just being brutally honest with you, I think he's right. I don't think Revelation is linear. It's circles. It's cycles. And if you listen to what he's got to say, and you see how he presents it, if you'll see it, there are cycles in the book, and they all follow the same pattern. Now, see, the reason why, when I first encountered that, I thought, there's no way that's right. But then I started just reading Revelation again, and I went, I don't like this, but I think he's onto something. And by the way, the oldest commentary that we have on the book of Revelation took the same view. And it's an early Christian document. Okay? So anyway, one to consider. David De Silva, very good scholar. By the way, a lot of times we're concerned with premillennialism. And we should be, because in the world, premillennialism is still very popular. But I do believe premillennialism is going to die out in popularity because in the world of academia, in the world of scholarship, premillennialism is dead. It is viewed as something that is completely foolish and unreasonable, save one or two schools. Okay, De Silva does a great job. These are maybe 200 pages. This one is, as is Unholy Allegiances. One of the greatest things De Silva helped me with was, when we say the book of Revelation is what most people would say, it's an apocalypse. Actually, it's the molding of 3 different literary genres. And they were always right there in front of my face, but I couldn't see it till De Silva pointed it out. That the whole book, not just the 7 letters to the 7 churches, but the whole book is an epistle. The whole book is also an apocalypse, and the whole book is also prophecy. He takes 3 literary genres and just throws them into the blender, and they all come out. And so anyway, he does a good job explaining that. These are about Dr. Ed Gallagher, who is one of my professors at Heritage. This is his most recent book on Daniel. It's maybe a little less than 200 pages. People say, on Daniel? Yes, because the approach is, so I have this theory about how we interpret, and I cannot prove it yet. I have not done all the research on it yet. But let's be honest, there are 12 of us in here, so it's not like I'm making some great claim, okay? So I'm very interested as well in the history of interpretation, okay? So the most popular, the most influential theologian that you know nothing about, is the way he was described to me, is William Miller, okay? Seventh-day Adventist, a lot of millennial groups broke off of him. And he was very big about taking the Bible and fixing dates on it. Now, again, I can't prove this. I've seen it. I've got some experience with other people's books. But as members of the church, I think a lot of times we interpreted those prophecies and said, we've got to find historical fulfillment of these prophecies specifically so that we can refute the idea of millennialism that Miller is producing. Instead of looking at those prophecies and saying, I don't think he was necessarily giving us a big timeline that you can trace with every minute detail. For an example, the 70 weeks of Daniel 9, if you will pay close attention and check people's math and their history, they don't work. And I'm not being ugly about that, and I'm not saying you should be a skeptic, but I'm telling you they just don't work. For another thing, in Daniel, when it says that the kingdom of Alexander is dispersed to the 4 winds of heaven. How is that most commonly interpreted? 4 generals. It breaks his kingdom into 4 generals. It's apocalyptic literature. And it went into, by the way, more than 4 generals. It went to about like 20 of them. And then finally narrowed down to about 3, and really all Daniel's concerned about is 2 of them. So is that really what he was talking about? Well, look, I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other. I'm just saying, if you want somebody, his PhD is from Hebrew Union. It is a Jewish school. You want somebody who knows Jewish thought inside and out? He's your guy. Book of Exodus, that's a cool book. These are written actually as Bible school materials. This is just like 13 lessons on 13 images from Exodus and how they play out in the New Testament, what their relationship is. It's a really good book, whether to teach or even to just read yourself. Theological Introduction to the Book of Psalms, that's a good book. It's a small book, but the Psalms, you know, for a long time, the Psalms were believed to be kind of like a hodgepodge of stuff that was just like, hey, we like this one, let's throw it in here. And we like this one, we're going to throw it in here. And this one will be 85, and this one will be 87. What scholars are now really starting to come on to is that maybe the Psalms are actually telling a really big story. And that these Psalms are actually a lot more closely connected than maybe we had imagined before. And he does a good job explaining some of that, getting the idea of the Psalms. Piercing Leviathan, God's defeat of evil in the book of Job. As well as I can understand Job, there are 3 basic interpretations. His is peculiar, and he tells you that. But Leviathan, of course, is one of the animals mentioned in the latter part of the discussion with God. Now, if you're like me, you've probably heard Behemoth and Leviathan always referred to as dinosaurs. I'm not saying that's not what it means, okay? But if you look at Jewish literature, Behemoth and Leviathan are more like mythological characters of chaos and evil, okay? And so really the discussion about that, thus Leviathan, piercing Leviathan, what God is saying to Job when Job is complaining about evil, God is saying to him, Job, I don't like evil any more than you do. And by the way, I'm going to do something about the evil that's in this world. And Leviathan and Behemoth are images that he uses to explain his triumph over evil. Look, whether you agree with him or not, I'm going to tell you something. It's a ride that will give you chills to think about that perspective. Okay? This is another evangelical commentary. They've started kind of a new series. They're very well done. This is one on the Psalms. This is Jim Hamilton at Southern Seminary. He stretches his case on some things a little too far, but he is one who this is a commentary on the Psalms that will argue that all of the Psalms are connected. That principle we were talking about a moment ago, he puts it in detail. All right, counseling. Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, the inventor of logotherapy, survivor of the Holocaust, lost many family members in it. But this is just a phenomenal read, I will tell you. It is not a light read. It's a small book. I could only read 1 chapter a week. It's so heavy emotionally. But he's talking about logotherapy, which is the idea of living with meaning and how meaning helps you in suffering. It's a tremendous read. It has been a game-changing book in the world of counseling. The Body Keeps the Score. For a long time, it was believed that counseling and a lot of stress and post-traumatic stress was simply cognitive. It was in our heads. This book has shown. Now, what's interesting is this man, the author, is not from America. He had family members who survived the Holocaust. But what he has found in working with veterans is, and this is now starting to change the game in how we treat people, is that actually trauma is embedded into your nervous system. In essence, your body puts a pin. And if anything ever comes close to that again, your body will, PTSD, what? I'm back in that moment right again. And so it's learning how that works. It's not just cognitive, it's also neurological. And how do you help and retrain neurological responses and reactions? It's heavy reading, but it's important reading, I think. All right, Resilience. This is a book by a Navy SEAL. He's writing to a friend of his struggling with PTSD, and he gives him lessons on life about how to adjust. Grisham's is a PhD from Oxford in like the classics of history and things along those lines. It's a good read. Boundaries, one of the most important books I've ever read for me. When to say yes, how to say no, and how people will try and guilt you. Well, you're a Christian and you won't do this. And it gives biblical responses. There's a whole series of these now. Boundaries in marriage, boundaries with your kids, boundaries with teenagers, boundaries at work, boundaries in marriage. Really, really important works. And I have a friend who's actually next month supposed to start in the Townsend Institute. It's an entire school of theology or school of psychology now. And I think at like UC Irvine or something like that. Atomic Habits by James Clear. Now, James Clear, he uses atheistic evolutionary illustrations. Obviously, they're ridiculous. But the book itself is phenomenal. Talking to us about habits or how habits are formed. And listen, when we talk to people about spiritual disciplines, what are they? They're habits. How do we help them? And he goes through all these different types of strategies of how our minds work. Marriage, this is actually just the rebranding of a book by Paul David Tripp. It's got an added chapter or two called What Did You Expect? This is the finest volume I've ever read on marriage, hands down. Save one or two things in the whole thing, like that's awesome. Okay, and as a matter of fact, I use it in premarital counseling. I use it in marital counseling. Whether I tell them that's what I'm doing, I don't always do that, but I'm using it. Okay, When Breath Becomes Air. This is another one of those heavy books. This is about a guy he grows up in the West Coast, and he's searching for the meaning of life, and so he goes and he gets super smart, gets all these degrees in literature, and then he decides he wants to be, I think, a brain surgeon. And as he's in his residency as a brain surgeon at Stanford Hospital, he's diagnosed with cancer, and thus When Breath Becomes Air. And it deals with his demise and how he meets death with such, that's one of those books I can't really put into words. Like, it's so deeply beautiful and moving and tragic and just all these emotions wrapped inside of it. This book, Ray Ortlund, The Death of Porn, Men of Integrity, Building a World of Nobility. So when we deal with pornography sometimes, there's a great sense of, what happened there? Okay. There's a great sense of shame that comes along with it. Ray Ortlund, basically he's in his 70s, and he's kind of writing like a grandfather and writing letters to the porn viewer. And the way he does it is it's just phenomenal. It's not long. And he's a man who's extremely gracious and understanding and caring. And I think it walks a fine line and fulfills a great need. Who Moved My Cheese? Very short book, but basically this is about life and ministry. It's, well, not about those things. It can be applied to those things. Basically, it's a fictitious story of you've got a big block of cheese in a room. Mice are eating it. As mice eat the cheese, what happens? The cheese gets smaller. And so then you have people's approach that says what? It's a conversation amongst the mice that say, okay, what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to stay here. I know I've got cheese. And another says, no, we got to strike out and go see if there's any more. And so it's the importance of how you handle change and not being stuck to your tradition and just staying with somewhere because I've got cheese there. Yeah, you got it now, but as you keep eating, it's going to be gone. You got to be willing to grow and press and do some things. And so it's a pretty cool book. All right, Preaching and Leadership. Extreme Ownership, tremendous read. And it means exactly what it says. Now, it's kind of a war-type book. Jocko and Leif are Navy SEALs. They fought with Chris Kyle, American Sniper. Jocko was the leader of their unit. And so every chapter begins with a story of war. And from it, he explains a principle. But the idea is, even if I'm in charge and someone under me makes the mistake, I'm the leader. I own it. It's mine. Okay? And so it's a tremendous book. Lit by Tony Reinke. It's a guide to Christian reading. and he does a tremendous job about how we interact with literature, not just religious books, but just literature in general. All right, The Pastor's Bookshelf by Austin Carty. His name's kind of cut off at the top. This is a tremendous read where he talks about the importance of reading in ministry. And I think one of the biggest takeaways I had from this book was this. A lot of people, when they say, I don't like to read because I can't remember. Hey, unless you're one of these few gifted people, none of us can. Reading is not about, the premise he puts forth in this book that helped me more than anything is, reading is not about information. It's about formation. Neuroplasticity, our brain's ability to, in essence, think of our brain's ability to expand as like a forest. And if you're trying to clear land, you knock down the first tree. You try and walk that property, and as all the trees are up, it's hard to navigate it. But you knock down one tree, get it out. You knock down another and get it out. It creates a pathway. Our brains are that way. There are neural pathways. And so that's why people say, I can't read as fast as this person, because you don't exercise that muscle as much as that person does. It's purely that. And so it's about more about who you're becoming and the blessings and benefits of reading. Honest to God preaching, talking sin, suffering, and violence. This has a tremendous take on imprecatory psalms where they're asking God to punish someone. And what I love about Strong's approach is he says, you notice that he's doing exactly what you should do. He's talking to God. He wants, in essence, he wants to kill somebody, strange as that sounds, right? But what does he do? What is he not doing? He's not killing them because he's talking to God. And so he's dealing with a lot of the things that go along and how we address tough subjects like sin, suffering, and violence and not be overly simplistic, because a lot of times our approaches can be. 7 challenges pastors face. I got this at a bookstore, didn't have any hopes for it at all, really. It turned out to be phenomenal. Dangerous Calling by Paul David Tripp. I'm just going to warn you, if you don't want a beating, don't read it. Okay? It is a phenomenal soul-searching read for anyone involved in any kind of ministry, but obviously a focus on preaching. Under the Unpredictable Plant, small book by Eugene Peterson that is about basically stop chasing churches like corporate ladders. Love the people that are entrusted to you. Okay? Not saying it's wrong to ever move anywhere. Obviously, I've done it. I think most of us have probably done it. But it's a great read. Bully Pulpit. I read this a couple years ago at the end of the year. The problem of spiritual abuse in the church. Notice spiritual abuse. What happens in pulpits is you get a bully up there who wants to push the people of God around. Or you get bullies in an office that want to bring people in, and we're going to ostracize members, and we're going to mistreat them, and we're going to abuse them, spiritually speaking, and damage them. This is a phenomenal treatment of that and what needs to be done. Lead Like the Lord. This is Kirk Brothers, president at Heritage. It's a tremendous book about just leadership in general. His PhD is in leadership from Southern. The President's Club. So this is before, I think it only goes through like Obama as the president's when this was written. That's just chronology is all it is. But one of the things I take away from this book is simply this. You've got these guys, okay, their beliefs, their foundational beliefs about politics are radically different. But you know what? Who do you call when you've got a decision to make as president and nobody really understands the weight of being president? Then one of the things I take away from this book is this. If these guys can find a way to get along and be supportive of each other, you'd think the people of God could do it too. It's an interesting read, and I think it has a good application. Current events. This is it. If you don't read any other book that I give you, this. The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. He is an atheist. He is a research psychologist. And he is explaining what is happening with young minds and social media and tablets and phones. And he's not a killjoy type of guy. He's not a radical approach. But this book is game-changing. Okay? The research is there. Everything is there. Just read it. Critical Theory, Biblical Critical Theory by Christopher Watkin. Basically, this is a very big, thick book. Okay? It's about this thick. But what it does is it traces the Bible story in about 14 or 15 different storylines. And so basically what it says is, if you take the story that the world is telling and you lay it against the story of the Bible, the story that the world is telling, not only is it unfulfilling, it's unsustainable. If you look at the story of the Bible, it is both fulfilling and sustainable. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant in the approach. Okay? Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. If you want to understand, and also Remaking of the World, if you want to understand how American culture got and developed in its thoughts, both of these kind of follow key individuals that kind of led us in one direction and then in another and then in another. These two do a great job. These are important books in my judgment. Preston Sprinkle, who is a scholar, but he writes for the general public. He does not write. He's done some scholarly work, but he writes more for everyday people. People to be Loved is addressing homosexuality, why homosexuality is not just an issue. Embodied is his approach, is his discussion of transgenderism. He keeps with the biblical line, but also teaches us what it means to actually love people. And if anybody were dealing with family, just wanting to think about the issue, preach on the issue, teach on the issue, if you go to him, he's going to be a phenomenal aid to you. Okay, this just kind of hits one of my research interests. I've always been fascinated with how Christian people justified slavery in the Civil War. Mark Knoll is a church history scholar. And one of the things I took from this book was simply this. One of the things he said that struck me was, you know why the Civil War happened? Why it was so significant? Because for the first time, Christian people couldn't agree on what the Bible said, and they put down their Bibles and they took up arms. And he gives perspective of how people justified it on either side, and then he gives perspectives of what people in Europe thought, Christians in Europe thought, how they viewed it. It's a pretty cool read, not a very long one. Okay, references. Commentary of the New Testament use on the Old Testament. This is purely that. It's a reference. So basically you're looking at the book of the Bible. It's broken into individual books. It's contributed to by authors, and they're assigned like a book of Matthew. And so you can go, if you're studying a text, say you're studying, I don't know, say you're studying Matthew 2:24-25 when he says, he shall be called a Nazarene. You can flip this open to Matthew 2:24 or 25. And they will give you, first of all, they'll give you the translation that's being quoted, whether it's the Hebrew text or the Greek text. That is, they'll tell you what it is. They're not going to actually put it in front of you. Then they'll say, in the original context of this passage, this is how it was used. And then they will say, this is how Jews throughout history interpreted that text. And then this is what we think that the writer is doing with it in this text. It is a really good one-stop shop resource for handling the Old Testament faithfully in the New. Okay. Of all the ones, this one probably makes me the most nervous to tell you about. Pseudepigrapha. Actually, there's one coming next that's kind of similar. The Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. Yeah, sorry. Time's up. These are two. Okay, so these are, look, a lot of people will try and tell you, people wrote these books to deceive you and to make you believe they were from God. No, they didn't. Okay? That was not their goal. They were just writing religious fiction, religious stories to try and inspire faithfulness. Okay? That's all they were. And by the way, when you look and you read these things, I'm going to tell you, we had to read Jubilees and the Life of Adam in a Genesis class I took last semester. It's interesting because this is telling us how Jewish people thought in the intertestament period when God was not speaking at that moment. I mean, this stuff, not only is it informative, it's just fascinating. I mean, it really is. Okay? Another, I would say, is the Apocrypha. Also presented by people to say, written by evil people trying to fool you. No. People say, well, it's attached to certain manuscripts. They were trying to insert them. Okay. And I know way more about this than I want to, but it's because Dr. Gallagher is a close friend, and this is his expertise, and this is all I hear about. Okay? And that is, even if you see the Apocrypha attached, it's always done at the end after Revelation, as if to say, I'm going to give you a book. Here is your Bible. Here are some other helpful, spiritually inspiring stories. It is not the idea that they are inspired. Okay, and one of my favorite things out of this, I read the book of, had to read Tobit for a class. And so in Tobit, there's basically this demon that comes in, and this woman who's getting married, and every time the night they're to consummate their marriage, the demon kills her husband before they can consummate the marriage. You know how many husbands she had? 7. Now, I can't prove this, but I just want you to think about this. Now, Master, there was a woman among us who was married to a man who died. And then her brother came in to raise up seed to her, and he died. And all 7 had her. But there were no children. Whose wife will she be in the resurrection? I wonder if this story, which was very popular then, is not where they start crafting this scenario from. Okay? Apostolic Fathers, early writings, very important too. Shepherd of Hermas, which is an old apocalyptic work, or the Didache. Didache is an important Christian document from most definitely the 2nd century, even could be 1st century. And it's kind of like a new convert's manual, probably in the region of Syria, that was based on Matthew. And it gives us an idea into how the early church operated. Now, it's also important because there's this Methodist scholar named Ben Witherington III who argues against baptism from this. Okay? Basically, what this says is if you baptize a person, baptize them in like cold running water. And if you can't have cold running water, then sprinkle some on their head. And so Witherington goes to this and he says, that proves baptism is not essential. Actually, all it proves is they lived in an arid region where water wasn't abundant. And they said, if you've got a person who's professed faith in Christ and you are left with the option of not baptizing, not putting any water on them at all, or immersing them, which you can't do, sprinkle some water on their head until you can get them to some water. That's all it says. But it's an interesting read. 12 Caesars, Suetonius, interesting. Backgrounds of early Christianity, Everett Ferguson, interesting. Okay, real quick. Fiction. I'm a Grisham guy. He's a Mississippi guy. I've met him. He's super, super nice guy. This is their latest book. It's a real stories of 10 people wrongfully convicted. And I put this up here because there's a story in here about a man who is falsely accused of a crime and he's excommunicated from his church. Basically, he's told not to come back. He's innocent. And also, we need to understand, and I'm thankful for the American justice system, but the American justice system is not perfect. Innocent people have been executed on trumped-up charges. And the supposed experts who convicted them weren't experts at all. Okay? We need to understand that. Mitch Albom, The Little Liar, this is a novel. I love this. It's fascinating because the narrator of the story is something called truth. And you see these statements like, truth, I'm the thing that everybody wants, but everybody else tries to also avoid. And so it's about a little boy. He lives in Thessalonica, in World War II, and they think, how do we get all the Jews to get on the train to send them to concentration camps? Well, we tell a little boy to tell the people, well, I've talked to the guy, and we're going to a free place where we're going to get new houses and all kinds of stuff. Except they fooled the little boy. I mean, really, really cool. Delete that, John Christ. I know this is going to sound strange. But if you want insight into what sin does and how it wrecks people, no matter what their exterior looks like, and the guilt that people can carry around, That book will offer you insight. Ordinary Men, um, this is based off so basically when World War II happened, Americans were convinced that what caused the Nazis to do what they did was there was something wrong with their brains. Okay? What they later found out was there was nothing wrong with their brains, and Americans went crazy when the psychiatrist who interviewed them said what happened there could just as easily have happened here. This book addresses similar issues. The Reserve Battalion 101 in Poland, men who weren't qualified to go to war for health reasons, how were they convinced to execute people in the Holocaust? And he makes an argument for it. It's phenomenal. Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried. We're dealing with a lot of people these days who've been to war. We need to kind of become familiar with some of those things. Kyle Carpenter, and I know my time is up, but I'm almost done too. You Are Worth It. This is just a cool story. There's an image here that I always use. He jumps on a grenade to save his friend, ends up surviving, wins the Congressional Medal of Honor. But there's this moment where he's back home living with his parents, and he said, I went into the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal. And, of course, he's got all this damage you can see even on his arms. And he takes it, and he's like, I'm trying to pour milk in it, and it's just going everywhere because his arm's not sturdy enough to hold it. And he said, I went to dip the spoon in and get it to my mouth, and it just slung it all out. And he said, for the first time in this 2-year process of recovery and surgery, I finally broke down and cried. He said, my mom came into the kitchen because she heard me. He said, I didn't want to bother her because she had been taking such good care of me and she needed to sleep. He said, I finally broke down and my mom came in and said, Kyle, what's wrong? And he said, Mom, look at me. Who is ever going to love me like this? There are people that feel that way. When you read about the leper who came to Jesus, who could ever love me this way? You remember that when the leper came to Jesus, he did not say to him, he did not doubt Jesus' ability to heal him. He says, you can make me clean. What he doubted was God's ability, Jesus' love for him, if you are willing. Do you love me enough to do something about it? And then finally, complicity in the Holocaust, how churches and universities were complicit in the greatest atrocity of the 20th century. Just going to put this out there because this is the last one and I'm done. You will hear things and you will read things in this book that you hear and read on the news and not from people you think. And I'm not saying that you should equate the two. I'm saying you should be cautious of those two. Because Germany was the most educated, sophisticated nation in its time, and it committed the greatest atrocity in the 20th century. And we're not exempt from it. And that book will help us and warn us against getting into bed with government. Thank you.